tell me challenges to democracy. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here. So one of the things, so I've been working with language models now for several years, and the concern I had was that if looking at 2016, there were bad actors that were trying to insinuate themselves in the democratic process, what happens now when these language models enter in and make it really easy to generate a lot of content, credible content, really quickly? So we wanted to map that terrain. And so we did an experiment and randomly sent AI generated text and human generated text to members of Congress, the state legislatures around the country. And we saw that members of Congress cannot tell the difference. And anyone who's worked with ChatGPT can see just how plausible sounding this content is. And so I think it's important for us to understand the threat and by way of mitigating that threat. And I think that's what we were trying to uncover with this research.
Sarah, when I think of where misinformation typically lives, that's on social media. So I have to ask, AI companies, folks like Sam Altman are going to Congress saying, hey, regulate us. Social media companies, you've kind of heard the same tune. Who do you think is actually, where does the onus fall in terms of who needs to intervene here and make sure that AI misinformation and the impact on democracy doesn't get out of control?
Right. I think what we've seen with technology and regulation is that often it's very reactive at the federal level. And I think there are good reasons for that. This technology is moving so quickly. And by contrast, for example, the European Union is trying to really lean into regulation. But I think there's a real risk that they are going to pass this AI Act and it will come into force and already be obsolete. So I think some of the onus actually is on the firms, and OpenAI has done some of this by making certain outputs not possible. So anyone who's done certain types of trying to push the boundaries on outputs might see that OpenAI doesn't actually permit those. So I think, again, this is a spirit of trying to understand through the public and private partnerships, government and firms, kind of what that risk is, that threat is, but also to try to think through and anticipate, is this a too early, to regulate or too late? And I think we're still really trying to understand what this technology is about. And so lurching into something at the federal level might be a little premature.
So following on what you said, Sarah, about the onus falling on the firms are made up of people. So I wonder, anytime there's a new leader in charge or they have someone else looking over regulation or their policy side, whatever they propose could change as well. How concerned are you about, I guess, the quality of people who are making these kinds of decisions at these big firms?
Right, and this is a great question, because we've been thinking about this for several years in different contexts. Content moderation, when Facebook was under fire for what they were permitting and not permitting, and it's a real debate about kind of outsourcing the public marketplace of ideas, for example, to private firms. And again, that's something that I think in Europe they're less tolerant of. And in the US, I think for a good reason, we're saying, let's let these firms innovate. But what we need to be thinking through is just what guardrails do we need in place to kind of guard against the more extreme consequences of those technologies.
It's interesting that you said Europe is already moving ahead and perhaps whatever policy they institute might become obsolete quickly. But because they are moving ahead, do they set the precedent that the U.S. then needs to kind of follow up with?
If we look at previous technologies, I don't think that we have, that the U.S. has fallen in lockstep at all with Europe when it comes to big tech and technology. And I think one reason is if you look at where big tech resides, it's almost exclusively in the United States. And so these things do become kind of circular, which is Europe is more inclined to lean into regulation, in part because it's not harming their firms. And the U.S., maybe because it has not leaned into regulation, has really, I think, fostered an environment of innovation. And again, kind of consequently, there are fewer incentives for the U.S. to be out in front. And I think, again, when we look at where there's an interesting story about Google's Bard, and they released it in 180 countries, but not in Europe. And, when we look at the history of big tech and legal, litigation, big tech, American companies have not always fared well in Europe. And so I think there is some wariness of ChatGPT, which was banned by the Italian government, other firms actually not only not following in lockstep, but really trying, quite apprehensive of engaging in that sort of European regulatory space. So I don't think the U.S. will go in that direction, not just because of what we're seeing already, but what we've seen with other forms of technology in the past.
Now, Sarah, you talk about the U.S. being reactive when it comes to regulation. We haven't seen any meaningful regulation against reining in the power of big tech, against reining in social media. What actually do you think needs to happen for AI regulations to cross the line here in the United States?
Yeah, it's a great question because, again, everything is so reactive. When we look back to the history of arms control, no, there was some indication that we should do arms control on nuclear weapons early, but really it didn't happen until after the Cuban Missile Crisis where the world almost blew up. And unfortunately, I think that it takes kind of a real crisis, existential crisis like that to happen before meaningful regulation can take place. And I do think it raises this question of are we at that point where meaningful regulation is needed? And I would submit that, we have some threats on the horizon, but because this technology is evolving so quickly, and because, frankly, I don't think these existential risks have presented and are really even a hypothetical risk, I think it is a little too early. But frankly, also we have to think about the political environment in Washington, which is not really conducive to doing anything meaningful on really anything, because there might be an agreement that something needs to be done, but disagreement on how to do it.